Episode 1. The Stranger's Arrival. The town's whispering heart. It was the kind of town that seemed to be forever frozen in time. The dusty streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, lined with houses that looked as though they had never known the touch of a fresh coat of paint. The buildings, though sturdy, wore the signs of age-chipped windows, rusted door hinges, and gardens overrun with tangled vines that hadn't seen a gardener in years. The air felt thick, as if the past was clinging to the present, unwilling to let go. Sarah Harris stepped off the bus and into the heart of Dunridge, a town tucked away from the rest of the world like a forgotten page in a book no one had read in decades. The sign at the edge of town read, "Welcome to Dunridge, a place to rest, a place to remember." It was an innocuous welcome, but it didn't sit right with her. Something about it felt like a warning, a cryptic message wrapped in the guise of hospitality. She hadn't meant to come here, not really, but the disappearances had intrigued her, and as a freelance journalist, she had no qualms about chasing stories. The mystery of a town where people went missing without a trace, and no one seemed to care, was one she couldn't ignore. You'll find the truth if you look hard enough, but be careful what you uncover, the old man at the bus station had warned her when she first arrived. His voice had been low, his eyes sharp as they studied her. He'd seemed like any other local at first, but there had been something in his gaze, something that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. The bus hummed its way back down the road, leaving Sarah alone in a town that felt too quiet, too still. She stood there for a moment, adjusting the straps of her worn backpack, and gazed across the empty street. Not a soul in sight. There were no children playing, no chatter from nearby cafes, no sound but the rustle of the wind and the distant creak of a door closing somewhere. It was unnervingly silent. A strange welcome. Sarah had expected a warm welcome from the locals, but instead, the empty streets and the watchful eyes that followed her every step unsettled her. She made her way toward the town center, where a single pub, its name, the Forgotten Hour, stood, nestled between two crumbling buildings. The faint sound of murmured conversation drifted out from within, mixing with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the pub was dark, only dimly lit by old lamps hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with smoke, and the patrons inside, all of whom seemed to be staring at her, wore expressions of quiet suspicion. They paused for just a moment, their gazes flicking over her before turning back to their drinks. Sarah ignored the stares and walked to the bar, where an older man with a weathered face and graying beard stood polishing a glass. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his voice rough, his eyes betraying little emotion. "I'm just passing through," Sarah replied, trying to smile. "I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the disappearances." At the mention of the word disappearances, the man's eyes briefly flicked toward the other patrons, who had become suddenly quiet. It was as though the room had grown tense, as though they were all waiting for something. Sarah noticed that none of the others were speaking, and the weight of their silence hung heavily in the air. The bartender leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You'd do well to stay out of it, miss. People like you come here all the time, asking questions. But nobody remembers anything, and it's better that way." Sarah leaned forward, sensing the man's reluctance to talk, but pressing on nonetheless. "But there have been so many disappearances. Someone must know something. There must be a connection." He set down the glass with a soft clink. "Not much to know," he said gruffly, "and not much we care to talk about. Those people are better off forgotten." The first echo. Sarah had to bite back her growing frustration. She had dealt with people like this before, those who tried to brush off the uncomfortable truths with vague answers. They never liked being reminded of things best left buried. "Then what happens to the people who disappear?" she asked, her voice growing more insistent. Before the bartender could respond, the door to the pub creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and darting nervously around the room. She quickly crossed the pub, not stopping to speak to anyone, and took a seat by the window, staring out into the darkening street. Her hands were shaking, her knuckles white as they gripped the edges of the table. Sarah's instincts went on high alert. Something about the woman seemed out of place, almost as though she were waiting for something or someone. The bartender noticed Sarah's gaze and, as if reading her mind, spoke again in a low voice. "She's new here. A lot of them come here looking for something that doesn't exist. The first clue. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah got up and walked over to the woman's table. She sat down across from her, and the woman didn't react, her gaze still fixed on the street outside. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I'm looking into the disappearances that have been happening here. You seem familiar. Do you know anything about it? Sarah asked, her voice soft but curious. The woman finally turned her gaze to Sarah, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. You should leave, she whispered, her voice trembling, before it takes you too. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The woman's cryptic words were enough to send a chill down her spine. The tension in the air seemed to thicken, and for a moment, she could have sworn she heard something, a whisper, faint but distinct, coming from the corner of the room. Something that didn't belong. What do you mean? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in her haste, and bolted for the door. Wait. Sarah shouted, but it was too late. The woman was gone. The echoes began as Sarah stood there, confused and unsettled. The room seemed to grow colder. The door had barely closed when the whispers started again, faint but unmistakable. You're being watched. You shouldn't have come. The words seemed to come from everywhere, yet no one spoke them aloud. They were echoes, whispers of the past, voices carried on the wind, or perhaps the very memories of the town itself. Suddenly, Sarah felt the overwhelming need to leave. She grabbed her things and quickly made her way outside. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, she saw a figure standing at the far end of the street, watching her. The figure didn't move. Her heart raced, and she quickly turned to head back to her hotel. She was being watched, just like the whispers had warned her. Cliffhanger ending. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was trying to keep her there. She glanced back once more, just in time to see the figure disappear into the shadows, as though it had never been there. The silence around her grew deafening, and for the first time since arriving, she wondered if she would ever leave Dunridge. Episode 2. The Forgotten Ones. The shadow of doubt. Sarah lay awake in her hotel room, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as the town of Dunridge hummed in the background, indifferent to her growing unease. The events from the evening replayed in her mind like a distorted dream. The woman at the pub, her frantic exit, and the whispers that had filled the air. It was all too much, too strange. Was it just paranoia? Or was there something real, something sinister, lurking beneath the surface of this sleepy town? She had come to Dunridge hoping to uncover the truth about the disappearances, to write an article that would reveal the town's darkest secret. But now, the more she dug, the more she began to feel like she was being drawn into something far beyond her control. She rolled over in bed, grabbing her notebook from the bedside table. Her pen scratched the paper, quickly jotting down everything that had happened. The cryptic warning from the bartender, the woman's panicked departure, the whispers that followed her. All of it felt connected, but to what? As she scribbled, Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on her door. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Hesitantly, she stood up and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw no one. Just the empty hallway, stretching out in both directions. But as her hand hesitated over the door handle, something caught her eye. A small slip of paper was wedged under the door, a dark ink scrawl on its surface. The message. Sarah picked up the note, unfolding it with trembling hands. It read, "They are watching. Don't trust anyone. The truth is buried in the library. But beware the echoes. Once you hear them, you cannot unhear them." Her heart raced as she read the words over and over. There was something urgent about the message. Something that made her feel as though she were being pulled into something that she might never escape from. The mention of the library caught her attention immediately. It was the only place in town she hadn't yet explored. The town's small library was located at the end of Main Street, next to the abandoned church. The place seemed like an afterthought, a building that barely registered on anyone's radar. But now, it felt like the key to understanding everything. Why the library? What secrets were buried there? Before Sarah could think further, she heard the sound of footsteps fading down the hallway. She rushed to the window, but when she peered outside, there was nothing, just the empty street, the dim lights flickering in the distance. The library's secrets. The following morning, Sarah made her way to the library with a growing sense of purpose. As she approached the building, the oppressive silence of the town seemed to press down on her even harder. It was as if the very air around her was stifling, the world narrowing until only the library remained. The building itself looked old, weathered stone, ivy creeping up its sides, and a heavy, wooden door that seemed to resist being opened. The place gave off an aura of neglect, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should turn back. But then, with a deep breath, she pushed the door open, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The interior of the library was even more unsettling than its exterior. Rows of dusty shelves, filled with old books, stretched out before her. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold and age, the kind of scent that made you feel like you were trespassing on something ancient. The place had an unsettling stillness, the kind that made you feel like you weren't alone, like something was waiting. Sarah walked deeper into the space, running her fingers over the spines of the books. Everything felt too quiet, too rigid, like the books themselves were holding their breath, waiting for her to make a move. She scanned the shelves, searching for anything that might explain the strange happenings. But the more she searched, the more she felt like she was looking for something that didn't exist. There were no clues, no answers. It was as though the truth had been erased. The echoes began. But then, as she moved toward the back of the library, she felt a shift. The air grew thick and heavy, like a weight had settled onto her shoulders. And then, she heard it, a voice. At first, it was just a faint murmur, like the sound of someone speaking in the distance. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart racing as she turned in every direction, looking for the source. But there was nothing, no one. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it sounded familiar, too familiar. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams the night before. The voice from the pub. The woman's voice, the one who had disappeared. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She felt an overwhelming chill run down her spine. The echo of the voice was impossible. There was no one else in the library. She was alone, wasn't she? But the voice continued. "The town doesn't forget." Suddenly, the books on the shelves began to rattle, and the lights above her flickered wildly. The air felt charged, as if the library itself had come to life, its memories awakening. Panicking, Sarah rushed to the exit, but before she could reach the door, a book flew from the shelf and hit the floor with a deafening crash. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the source. A small, old leather-bound book lay in the center of the floor, its pages fluttering open on their own. The book's warning, with trembling hands, Sarah bent down to pick it up. The title, embossed in gold, was Echoes of the Forgotten. She opened the book, her fingers brushing over the pages, and began to read. As she read, the words seemed to shift and blur before her eyes. They weren't written in English anymore, but in a script she couldn't recognize. But as she turned to the final page, she found something familiar, a handwritten note scrawled in the margin. "You are the next to be erased." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Erased? Before she could process the meaning of the words, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the entire library began to shake. The books began to fall from the shelves, scattering across the floor in a chaotic mess. And then she heard the loud crash of something heavy behind her. She turned and saw the shadow of a figure standing at the far end of the library. A voice echoed from the darkness, low and menacing, "You shouldn't have come." Cliffhanger ending. The doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking her inside. Sarah's heart raced as the figure approached, its shape now becoming clearer. She could feel the weight of its presence, an unseen force moving toward her. The last thing she heard before the lights flickered out was a whisper, "You will never remember." Episode 3. Echoes in the Walls. The walls have ears. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the library door behind her, the cold air from outside biting at her skin. She glanced down at the book, in her hands Echoes of the Forgotten. The chilling warning she had read lingered in her mind, weighing her down like a shackle around her soul. "You are the next to be erased." Her heart raced with disbelief and fear. This couldn't be happening. She had come to this town to find answers, not to become part of its twisted curse. But the longer she stayed, the more she began to feel like the answers were slipping away from her, vanishing like smoke in the wind. The unsettling whispers still echoed in her ears, a lingering presence she couldn't shake. It was as if the very walls of Dunridge were alive, watching, waiting. "I need to get out of here," Sarah whispered to herself, But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were futile. She couldn't escape, not yet. There were too many questions, and she had to find the answers before they consumed her completely. She looked at the streets again, the same empty streets she had passed earlier. They seemed to beckon her, silent and knowing. Something in this town wasn't right, and Sarah felt like she was standing at the edge of a deep, dark abyss. Every corner she turned led to another clue, another fragment of the puzzle, but the more she uncovered, the more tangled the web became. A town of forgotten souls. As Sarah walked toward the town center, the air grew heavier with each step. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. The town had a strange, unnatural stillness to it, as though everyone had gone into hiding. She passed a row of empty houses, each one the same, a dilapidated facade, a quiet emptiness inside. The windows were dark, the doors shut tight, and there were no signs of life. It was as though the people had simply vanished, leaving behind their homes, their lives, their memories. The eerie silence was broken by a sudden creak, the sound of an old door opening. Sarah turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, an old woman, hunched and frail, her face obscured by a long, tangled veil. Her eyes were hidden, but Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze, cold and unwavering. The woman didn't speak. She just stared at Sarah for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Sarah standing frozen on the sidewalk. What was that? Sarah wondered. Who was she? The town's hidden truths. Determined to continue her investigation, Sarah made her way toward the center of town, where the old town hall stood, a tall, imposing building that had seen better days. The structure was clearly falling apart, but there was something about it, something that made Sarah feel like it was the key to unlocking the town's dark secrets. She pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The interior was as oppressive as the exterior, with dim lighting, faded wallpaper, and old, creaky floors. The air inside was thick, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. A sense of decay permeated the place, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking through a museum of forgotten memories. She wandered through the halls, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As she explored, she noticed that the town hall was filled with old photographs, faded black and white images of families, town meetings, and celebrations. But there was something odd about the photographs. Many of the people in the pictures were blurry, their faces unclear, as though someone had deliberately erased their identities. It wasn't just the photographs. The records, the documents, the letters, they all seemed incomplete, as though large portions of information had been deliberately removed. A chill crept up Sarah's spine as she realized that the town was systematically erasing its own history. And that's when she saw it. A large old ledger sat on the desk at the far end of the room. It was covered in dust, but the red ink on its spine seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Sarah walked toward it, her fingers brushing against the surface. As she opened it, she saw something that made her heart stop. The pages were filled with names of people, but there was something off about them. Some of the names were crossed out, others had detailed dates next to them, dates that corresponded to the disappearances that had haunted the town for decades. And then, at the bottom of the page, one name stood out, Sarah Harris. The unraveling Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her name written in the same red ink that had marked the other names. It was clear that this was no coincidence. She stumbled backward, the book falling from her hands. How could this be possible? She had only arrived in Dunridge recently. She couldn't have been listed in some old ledger, could she? The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her name, her very existence, had somehow become part of this town's twisted history. Just then, a voice echoed from behind her, low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. The room felt suddenly darker, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her. She rushed to the door, but before she could reach it, a sound, a voice, familiar yet distorted, spoke from the shadows. "The truth is here, but you won't remember it." The echoes from the walls grew louder, the whispers turning into screams. Sarah's vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to collapse into a spiraling vortex of memories, of people, of lost souls. The final warning, desperate to escape, Sarah stumbled into the hallway, but the walls themselves seemed to be shifting, shifting around her. She had to get out. She had to leave before it was too late. Her heart raced as she pushed open the door, her breath coming in short gasps. The street outside was empty, the same as before. But now the air felt different, heavier. Something had changed. The town had changed. She had become a part of something she couldn't fully understand. And as she looked back at the town hall, one final whisper echoed through the air. "You are not free." Cliffhanger ending. As Sarah stood frozen, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Someone or something was getting closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. There was no escaping now. And as the footsteps grew louder, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. The town was never going to let her leave. Episode 4. The Collective Mind, the Weight of the Truth. The streets of Dunridge seemed quieter than ever as Sarah stepped into the cool morning air, the fog still clinging to the town like a blanket, hiding its secrets. She could feel the coldness of the place in her bones, as if it were not just the weather that chilled her, but something more sinister, the palpable presence of a town that had been forgotten by time, by memory, by everything. But she could no longer afford to ignore it. The truth, or at least a part of it, was staring her in the face, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. The ledger had been a turning point, a final confirmation that something was terribly wrong in this town. The page where her name appeared in that book, written in blood-red ink, had haunted her through the night. She had tried to dismiss it, tried to convince herself that it was some prank or coincidence, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Someone or something had been keeping track of her, even before she stepped foot in Dunridge. The unseen forces. The more she thought about it, the more the whispers from the library and the cryptic messages seemed to align. It wasn't just the people she had to worry about. The town itself felt as though it had a life of its own, an invisible force that was controlling everything. The strange, persistent sense of being watched haunted her every step, like invisible eyes in the shadows. At the cafe, she saw Ben, the young man who had greeted her at the bus station when she first arrived. He had been polite, helpful, but now he looked at her differently, as if he knew something she didn't. She had tried to ask him about the disappearances, but he had brushed her off, his expression too guarded. But now, as she sat down across from him, something had changed in his eyes. His usual casual demeanor was gone, replaced by something more cautious, almost fearful. "You've been asking around about things you don't understand," Ben said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should stop." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Ben glanced around the cafe, checking to make sure no one was listening. "It's dangerous, Sarah. You think you're just uncovering a mystery, but it's much more than that. The disappearances, the memories being erased, they're not random. They're part of something bigger, a collective mind." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A collective mind? What does that even mean? Ben's eyes shifted nervously. "It means that everyone here is connected, not just by the town, but by something far more powerful, something we can't escape. If you keep digging, if you keep pushing, you'll get lost in it too. You'll become part of the memory." The unraveling begins. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the cafe opened with a sudden gust of wind, and a group of townsfolk entered, laughing and talking loudly. Ben immediately fell silent, his gaze flicking nervously to the group before he stood up abruptly. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Leave, now." Sarah's confusion grew, but she knew one thing. Whatever was going on, Ben knew far more than he was letting on. She had to find out what was happening in this town before it swallowed her whole. "Ben," she started, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Sarah felt the familiar dread creeping back into her chest. The town was closing in on her, but she couldn't stop now. There was something here, something hidden in the deepest corners of Dunridge, and she was determined to uncover it. A town's true history. The fog had grown thicker by the time Sarah made her way back to the town's library. The air was so thick she could barely see 2 steps in front of her. As she approached the entrance, she hesitated, wondering if the town was now actively trying to keep her away from the truth. But she had no choice. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The musty smell of old paper and dust filled her lungs, but this time the library felt different, more alive. The air was charged with tension, as if the books themselves were waiting for her to make the next move. As Sarah ventured deeper into the library, the oppressive silence was broken by a soft whisper, faint, but unmistakable. The past is alive in these walls. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice sounded so familiar, but there was no one around. Her mind raced as she walked toward the back of the library. She couldn't shake the feeling that the books were watching her, their pages filled with stories she was not meant to uncover. In the back corner, hidden behind a stack of old books, she found a trapdoor. It was almost imperceptible, covered in layers of dust and hidden beneath a pile of abandoned books. Her pulse quickened as she knelt down to examine it, her fingers brushing against the rough surface. This was it, the final piece. The truth in the shadows. With a deep breath, Sarah opened the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest as she descended, each step echoing in the silent void below. She could feel the weight of the air around her, thick with years of secrets, as if the town itself had been waiting for her to find this hidden place. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah entered a small chamber, its walls lined with rows of old bookshelves and strange symbols etched into the stone. The room felt ancient, untouched by time, yet somehow alive. And in the center of the room, there was a single book, its pages blank. As Sarah reached for it, a sharp coldness gripped her, a sudden chill that made her breath catch in her throat. She opened the book. The pages began to fill with words her own handwriting, written in red ink. The words formed a chilling message. You are not the first to ask questions. The others who came before you, they never left. Sarah's blood ran cold as the pages continued to fill with more of her words. But each sentence felt like it wasn't her own. It was as if the book was speaking through her, controlling her. The walls around her began to whisper, the voices growing louder until they became deafening. The air seemed to constrict around her as the truth was revealed, piece by piece. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a sharp crackling sound. The lights above flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. The book in Sarah's hands began to glow, its pages burning with an unnatural fire. The voices returned, louder and more frantic. You have awakened it. Sarah backed away, her chest tight, her mind racing. What had she done? What was this place? And why had the town been hiding it for so long? The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the room shaking as if the very earth was rejecting her presence. Before she could react, a dark shape appeared in the doorway, a figure, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. It's too late, the figure whispered. You can't undo what's already been done. The figure stepped forward, and everything went black. Episode 5. The Echoing Death. The inescapable web. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts as she stumbled back from the shadowy figure that had appeared at the door. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, the cold weight of her fear pressing down on her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the air around her seemed to thicken, constricting, pushing her toward the dark presence that stood like a wall between her and the exit. The figure was tall, its form obscured by the shadows in the corner of the room. Its outline was barely discernible, like a man, but somehow not, its features too distorted, its movements unnatural, as though it didn't belong in the world she knew. There was a sense of wrongness in the way it moved, something that didn't align with the natural world. It stepped forward, and the room grew colder. Sarah could see now that it wasn't just the darkness that clouded its form, it was the absence of light itself. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, swallowing up any warmth or clarity. You shouldn't have come. The voice was low, a rasping whisper that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. It wasn't quite a voice, it was a presence, a force that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Sarah's legs trembled beneath her. What was this thing? And why was it after her? The truth reveals itself. The figure did not move quickly, but with each step it took, the shadows seemed to reach out and touch Sarah, making the walls pulse with a dark, rhythmic thrum. She was being pulled into its grip, helpless, as though something invisible was pressing her against the floor. You know why you're here, don't you? The figure murmured. Its voice was so deep it seemed to come from the very walls themselves, as though the town itself were speaking to her. Sarah forced herself to speak, her voice trembling but steady. I don't understand. Why am I here? What is this place? The figure tilted its head, the shadows shifting in a way that felt almost alive. This place is everything. The memories, the souls, the stories, all bound together. The cycle you're fighting, Sarah, it's not just about you. It's about the town. It always has been. The words rang in Sarah's ears, reverberating through her skull. She was overwhelmed, her mind spinning. She felt like she was standing on the edge of some terrifying truth, a precipice that, if she fell, she might never climb back from. The whispers in her ears grew louder, more insistent. This town's history is not what it seems. You've heard the whispers, you've seen the disappearances. But what you don't know is that the town is built on the foundation of forgotten souls. Those who vanished, they're not lost. They're part of the town's memory, a voice from the past. As the figure spoke, the room seemed to shift again. The air became thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the walls around her seemed to bleed shadows. The whispers from the past voices of people she had never met began to echo, faint at first, then growing louder and more frantic, as though they were trying to warn her. Sarah closed her eyes, her head spinning. She could hear them now, the voices of the disappeared calling to her. "We're here, Sarah. We never left." The voices seemed to surround her, pulling her deeper into the twisted reality of Dunridge. The figure continued, its voice becoming more urgent. "You are not just investigating these disappearances, Sarah. You are part of the town's curse. You are a piece of its history. And if you don't stop now, you will fade from memory. Just like the others." The words hit her like a physical blow. Fading from memory? How was that possible? How could she be part of this nightmare? Suddenly, a flash of recognition hit her, a memory, half-formed, flickering like an old film reel. She saw herself, younger, standing in the same library she had visited earlier. But there was someone else with her, a young woman, her face a blur, but Sarah knew her. Sophie. Sarah gasped, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, and it smiled. "You're starting to remember. The sacrifice." The memory came flooding back in pieces. Sophie Carter, the missing woman, the one who had disappeared over 15 years ago. She had been Sarah's childhood friend, but Sarah couldn't remember the details, couldn't piece it together. All she remembered was the guilt, the feeling that Sophie's disappearance had something to do with her, something she had done or failed to do. The figure reached out, its hand a dark blur in the dim light, and touched Sarah's shoulder. The coldness radiated from its hand, a bone-deep chill that spread through Sarah's body. "You're just like her." The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. "You were meant to be forgotten. But unlike Sophie, you have a choice." Sarah blinked, her head spinning. "A choice?" she repeated. "Yes," the figure whispered, its voice almost too soft to hear. "To become part of the town's history. To be erased from the world entirely, or to take the place of the ones who came before you. To be the sacrifice. The choice of a lifetime." The words settled in Sarah's mind like poison, slowly spreading, consuming her thoughts. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The town of Dunridge, the memories, the disappearances, it was all too much. And now, she had to make a choice, to fade away, to become part of the forgotten, or to sacrifice herself for the town's survival. If you take their place, you will become part of the feed. You will become the one who controls the memories, the one who keeps the cycle going. But you will never be free. The figure's words were final, heavy with the weight of the decision Sarah had to make. If you let go, if you fade away, it continued, you will be free. But the town will collapse. All its history will be erased. Everything will be lost. The final decision, Sarah's chest tightened. She could feel the pressure of the decision pressing down on her, suffocating her. The weight of the town's curse was bearing down on her, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to resist it. Her hands shook as she took a step back, her mind racing. Could she save herself and the town? Could she break the curse? Or was it already too late? Was there even a way out? In the distance, the whispers grew louder, the souls of the forgotten calling out, pulling at her, trying to draw her into the town's eternal memory. The figure reached out again, its shadowy hand closing in on Sarah. "The choice is yours. But remember, this is the last chance you will ever get." Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air, a scream that sent Sarah's blood cold. She spun around, her eyes searching the room. And there, in the corner, she saw the young woman, the one from her memory. Sophie. But Sophie wasn't alone. The shadows surrounded her, coiling like a serpent, pulling her into the abyss. Sophie's eyes met Sarah's wide with fear, but there was something else there, something that Sarah couldn't place. And then, with a final scream, Sophie was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Episode 6. The last memory, the edge of reality. The darkness that had swallowed Sarah's mind in the last moments of episode 5 had left a lasting mark on her. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie, the woman who had once been a part of her life, now reduced to a shadow of fleeting memory in the void. The town of Dunridge, with all its eerie silence and hidden horrors, had become more than just a place to investigate. It had become a nightmare, a living, breathing entity that had wrapped itself around her soul. Every corner she turned seemed to push her deeper into an ever-expanding abyss. As Sarah walked down the cobbled streets the next morning, the fog still clung to the town like an impenetrable veil. It wasn't just the weather, it felt like the town itself was cloaked in uncertainty. As though reality were starting to blur at the edges, she needed answers. She needed to understand what happened to Sophie, what happened to everyone who had disappeared. The ledger had told her that she wasn't just an outsider, she was woven into the very fabric of the town's curse. And yet, every step she took brought her closer to a truth that was too terrifying to comprehend. The broken memory. The library, Sarah's reluctant sanctuary, was now her only hope. The town hall had yielded no further clues. The streets were deserted, and the townspeople grew more and more hostile with every question she asked. Dunridge was closing in on her. The library had been the first place she had felt a connection to something tangible, a place where the echoes of the past whispered secrets she had to uncover. As she approached the entrance, she hesitated for just a moment, the door heavy in her hand. She could feel it, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, but there was no turning back. She had already crossed the threshold into something far beyond her understanding. Inside, the air was still, the dusty shelves towering over her. But today, it felt different. The silence wasn't calm anymore, it was foreboding, suffocating, as if the very walls were breathing, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She walked past the rows of ancient books, her fingers brushing against the worn spines as if searching for something familiar, something that would guide her through the dark. But all she found were more whispers, more echoes of the past. That's when she saw it. A hidden door, barely noticeable in the far corner of the library. It was tucked between two shelves of books, almost as though it didn't belong here at all. The door was cracked open just slightly, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness beyond. Her heart raced as she stepped toward it, her breath shallow. There was a sense of urgency now, as though the very fabric of the town was pulling her toward this unknown place. The forgotten hallway. The moment she stepped through the door, the air grew colder. A narrow hallway stretched before her, lit by faint flickering sconces that cast long shadows on the stone walls. The musty smell of old paper mixed with something else, something decayed, as though the space hadn't been disturbed in centuries. As Sarah moved deeper into the hallway, she felt the weight of the town's history pressing in on her. This place had been hidden, locked away, for a reason, and now it was calling to her. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, grew louder the further she went. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking to her, urging her to listen, to remember. At the end of the hallway was another door. Unlike the rest of the library, it wasn't wooden or rusty. This door was newer, but it didn't belong here. It was out of place, standing stark against the decaying stone of the corridor. Sarah reached for the handle, her hand trembling. The door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan, revealing a room filled with old photographs, faded maps, and artifacts she couldn't comprehend. But in the center of the room was a single object, a large mirror standing upright against the far wall. The mirror was unlike any she had seen before. Its frame was ancient, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. But what caught Sarah's attention were the reflections. They didn't match the room. There was something in the mirror that wasn't real. As she stepped closer, her pulse quickened. The reflections were distorted images of people she didn't recognize, faces from long ago, but they were not static. They moved, as though they were trying to reach out to her. And there, at the center of the mirror, was a figure, a shadowy outline of a person. The reflection seemed to stare back at her, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw the figure move. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her heart thudded in her chest as she leaned closer to the mirror. This was it, the truth she had been searching for. But the closer she got, the more the whispers grew into something more. They were no longer just faint sounds in the distance. They were voices, screams, and pleas for help. all mingling together in a cacophony of pain and fear. The truth behind the mirror. You should have left when you had the chance. The voice echoed in her mind. It was cold, distant, yet familiar. Sarah froze as she heard the words. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sophie's voice. The whispers intensified, and suddenly the mirror began to pulse. The reflections within it shifted rapidly, like a time lapse of faces and events, some of which Sarah recognized, others that seemed too distant, too disconnected. But one image stood out among them. A young girl, her face obscured, standing in front of a tall, ominous figure. As Sarah stared at the girl's image, a wave of recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. The girl's face, it was hers. The mirror reflected Sarah, but not the Sarah she knew. This version of her was pale, gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. And behind her, looming in the shadows, was the figure of Sophie, staring at her with hollow eyes. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on Sarah as the mirror's reflection pulled her in. The truth was right in front of her, and yet it felt like she couldn't reach it, like it was slipping through her fingers, just out of her grasp. The unraveling begins. Before Sarah could react, the mirror shattered. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, and she staggered back, instinctively covering her head as shards rained down around her. In the chaos, the voices grew louder, all at once, deafening, impossible to ignore. The room around her seemed to spin, the walls closing in. But then the chaos stopped as suddenly as it had started. Everything fell silent. Too silent. Sarah opened her eyes, her breath shallow. The shards of glass had disappeared. The mirror was gone, leaving nothing but an empty, hollow space where it once stood. "It's too late, Sarah." The voice came again, Sophie's voice, but now it sounded empty, as if it had lost all its life. "You're one of us now." Sarah felt the walls of the room close around her, suffocating her. The air seemed to grow thick, the shadows pressing against her skin. She was trapped in this town, in this nightmare, with no way to escape. The door to the hidden room slammed shut behind her with a loud bang, and the floor beneath her feet began to vibrate. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the whispers returned, this time clearer, more urgent. Sarah had to make a choice. Was she going to remain a part of this cycle, or was there still a way to break free? Episode 7. The final sacrifice, a world unraveling. The town of Dunridge had always felt unnatural, a place where time seemed to stand still, as though it were suspended in a fog of confusion and forgotten memories. But now, Sarah could feel the very fabric of the town shifting, tearing at the seams. With every step, the air grew thicker, and the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She had spent days trying to piece together the town's dark history, sifting through old records, forgotten books, and frantic whispers from those still living in Dunridge. The townspeople, with their vacant expressions and strange behaviors, were more like shadows than real people, as if they were mere echoes of the souls they once were. And now, after everything, after all the uncovering and digging, Sarah knew that she had reached the heart of it all. The truth was within her grasp, but it came with a price. A terrible price. As she walked through the narrow streets, the fog thickened around her, obscuring everything. She could feel the oppressive weight of the town's secrets, pressing against her chest like a physical force. The whispers that had followed her since her arrival were now louder than ever, growing more frantic. They weren't just echoes anymore, they were warnings. She knew what she had to do. The choice she must make. The library, once a place of knowledge and hope, had become her prison. Each room, each corner, seemed to have its own memory, its own presence. As Sarah approached the steps leading to the back of the library, she could feel the unease building in her gut. The town itself seemed to be drawing her back to this place, its center, its very soul. There, deep beneath the library, in the hidden chamber she had found weeks ago, was the truth. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that knowledge was not enough. What lay hidden beneath the surface was not just a curse, it was a force that fed on memory, on identity, on the very essence of who they were. Sarah stepped through the now familiar door of the hidden room, feeling a coldness wash over her. The shadowy figures had followed her, watching her every move. She could feel their eyes on her, piercing through the air, filling the space with their silent judgment. And there, in the center of the room, stood the same mirror she had encountered before. But this time, it wasn't the same. This mirror, like the rest of Dunridge, had changed. Confronting the past, the reflection in the mirror was twisted, distorted, like a nightmare. Sarah stared at herself, but the reflection was not her. It was someone else, a version of her that had been forgotten, erased. The shadows around her grew darker, the figure in the mirror becoming more familiar. Suddenly, the mirror shattered with a deafening crash, sending glass scattering across the floor. Sarah screamed, but no sound came out. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't breathe. The voices in her head grew louder, more urgent. "You have to decide." The words came from every direction, an overwhelming chorus of distant voices, the lost souls, the forgotten people of Dunridge. "You can stop it. You can be the one to break the cycle, but it will cost you everything." Sarah's heart pounded. What was the cycle? What was the cost? And how could she break free from this endless nightmare? The sacrifice. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled, as if the very earth was reacting to her fear. The shadowy figure from before appeared again, stepping out of the darkness, its shape growing clearer. This time, Sarah could see it, the demonic form that had been pulling the strings behind everything. It was the same figure from her past, the one who had disappeared. Sophie. Her face was obscured, but Sarah could still feel her. Sophie had been a part of this all along, tied to the town's curse, to its collective memory. But now, she wasn't just an echo in the shadows, she was the keeper of the town's history. "You know what must be done." Sophie's voice echoed in Sarah's mind. "The truth will destroy you if you don't sacrifice it all." Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling. "What is this? What do you want from me?" Sophie's eyes, black as coal, flickered with a haunting light. "You have to give yourself to it. To the town. To the cycle. Only then can you set us all free. Only then can you stop the erasure. You are the final piece, Sarah. The last soul to be consumed by this place. The final choice." Sarah stood at the precipice, staring into the abyss of her own mind. The weight of the choice pressed down on her like an avalanche, the knowledge of what was at stake overwhelming her senses. The voices in her mind, the memories of the lost souls, echoed with urgency. What did it mean to be erased? To be forgotten? Was that the only way to stop the cycle of horror? The price was steep. Her identity, her very existence, would be gone forever. She would be lost, consumed by the town and its curse. But if she didn't make the sacrifice, the cycle would continue forever, and Dunridge, its people, its very soul, would be lost in eternal darkness. "You will never escape, Sarah." The voice from behind her, Sophie's voice, grew stronger, more insistent. "There is no going back." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of her decision pulling her under. Her mind raced with the faces of the people she had met, the residents of Dunridge, the lost souls, all trapped in this web of memory. She thought of Sophie, of the girl she had once been, of the choices that had led her here. And then she made her decision. The moment of truth. The mirror shattered again, the pieces falling like glass raindrops, scattering across the floor. The air around Sarah grew thick with the weight of her choice. And in that moment, everything went silent. But then, she heard something, a whisper from deep within herself. It was faint, like the last breath of someone long forgotten. "You are not alone." It wasn't Sophie's voice. It wasn't the voice of the shadow. It was her own, a part of herself that had been hidden, buried beneath the weight of the curse, the truth of her identity. And with that whisper, the cycle was broken. Episode 8. The final memory, a broken reflection. The air was thick with a palpable tension, as though the very atmosphere of Dunridge had become a living, breathing entity. The moment Sarah made her decision to break the curse, it felt as though the world around her had taken a sharp turn, spiraling into an even darker abyss. The mirror that had once been a tool for uncovering truths now felt like the final barrier, a gateway to something darker than she could imagine. The shattered shards of glass lay scattered on the floor of the hidden room beneath the library. Yet the reflections remained alive in her mind. They had stuck with her, haunting her every step. Her eyes flickered to the cold, cracked mirror that had once held Sophie's face, the figure of the woman who had long since been consumed by the curse. Sophie's absence felt even more oppressive now, as though her very soul was still trapped in the shadows, waiting for the final release. Sarah could feel the weight of the lost memories, the forgotten faces, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. "You can't escape what's been done." The voice echoed again in her mind, the same dark whisper that had warned her before. This time, it didn't feel like Sophie's voice, it was something else. Something ancient. Sarah's legs felt like lead as she staggered backward, but the echoes followed her. The town, its people, the whispers, they were becoming too much. It wasn't just the physical boundaries that confined her anymore, it was the mental prison. The forgotten library. She rushed back to the library, its walls now closing in on her like a great tomb. Every book on the shelf seemed to watch her, its titles unimportant, the words meaningless. What once had been a place of hope now felt like the center of an endless labyrinth. She could still hear the muffled whispers that had plagued her from the moment she first entered. She had made a terrible mistake by reopening the doors of the forgotten past. The town was unraveling at the seams, and Sarah had become an unwilling player in its twisted game. There was no escape. Even if she tried to leave, even if she fled Dunridge, the curse would follow her. The town's history, the memories of those lost, would haunt her until she was swallowed whole by the same fate that had claimed everyone before her. Sarah slammed the heavy door shut behind her, but the pressure of the air in the room made it feel as though the room itself was closing in. She paced back and forth, each breath more labored than the last. Her skin felt clammy, and her heart raced in her chest. She had seen enough to know what had happened to the others, the ones who had disappeared. And now, she feared that she was the next in line. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the shelves of ancient tomes. The books were not just books, they were vessels of memory, repositories of everything the town had ever known, and everything it had erased. She needed to find the answers, the final answer, before it was too late. The Forgotten Souls. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled a thick volume from the shelf, its pages worn and yellowed with age. The title was faded, but she could just make out the words, The Forgotten Ones. She opened the book, her eyes scanning the pages, but her heart dropped as she read. The book was filled with accounts of people who had come to Dunridge, visitors, travelers, and even the townspeople themselves who had disappeared, never to be seen again. But the most disturbing part was the last section, the one that spoke of Sarah herself. She is the final one, the one who will end the curse. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew the stories, knew the disappearances, but she had never expected to see her own name etched into the pages of this dark history. She flipped to the next page, and there, in red ink, was a warning. The last memory will be her own undoing. She will either save the town or become part of its eternal suffering. The words were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. Sarah was trapped in the same cycle that had claimed all the others. She was the final sacrifice, the one who would either break the curse or become its last victim. The time is now. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, the air growing heavier by the second. As Sarah processed the horrifying truth, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The very town itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. The shadows in the corners of the library shifted, like living creatures, reaching out for her. And then, the whispers grew louder than they had ever been before. They were everywhere. The souls, the lost ones, the forgotten, they were closing in, their voices mingling with her thoughts. You can't break it. The voice was a mix of Sophie's voice and something darker. You'll never be able to stop it. But Sarah's mind was no longer clouded by doubt. She had come this far. She knew what she had to do. She closed the book and walked toward the back of the library, where she had first found the hidden doorway. The whispering grew more frantic as she approached, like a storm of memories, each voice urging her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't. She had already gone too far. The descent. Sarah pushed open the door and descended into the hidden chamber once again. The same darkness enveloped her as she moved deeper into the bowels of the library. The coldness from the previous encounter seemed to grow more intense, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. At the far end of the chamber, she saw it again, the mirror. But this time, it was different. It seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, its surface shimmering with dark light. As she stepped closer, the memories of the forgotten souls appeared in the reflection faces, figures she had never seen before, all staring back at her with hollow eyes. She reached out, touching the cold glass, and in that moment, the world around her seemed to shudder. The ground beneath her feet cracked, splitting open as the voices became deafening. The final choice, Sarah. Will you become the memory or erase the past? The final choice. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room, blinding her. The whispers turned into screams, the voices of the forgotten rising in a crescendo. Sarah's head spun, and the pain in her chest grew unbearable. She wanted to scream, to run, but the mirror was pulling her in, the memory of the town clawing at her from every direction. In the reflection, she saw herself, her true self. But it wasn't the Sarah she had known. It was a shadow, a ghost of what she once was, and she knew that if she stayed in this town, if she allowed the curse to consume her, she would become just like the others, forgotten. The choice was hers. She could either let herself fade into nothingness, like all the others, or she could rewrite history and break the town's curse forever. The memory of Dunridge would remain, but it would no longer have control over her. With a final breath, Sarah stepped forward, reaching out to the mirror, her fingers brushing against the surface as the world around her dissolved into darkness. Episode 9. The breaking point. A whisper in the dark. The world around Sarah seemed to fracture. The mirror, once a reflection of her deepest fears, had now become the catalyst for her descent into the darkest depths of Dunridge. She had made her choice, or so she thought. But as the glass shattered, the very fabric of reality had started to unravel around her. The air was thick with a cold, suffocating energy, like the town itself was drawing in a final breath before it would either crush her or spit her out. The whispers, those maddening voices that had followed her since her first step into Dunridge, now swirled around her like a storm. They were louder, clearer, and more urgent than ever before. You can't escape. It's already too late. The voice came from everywhere, from every corner, every crack in the walls. And it was not just the voices of the forgotten people. There was something else, something older, something that had been buried in the town's twisted history, waiting for someone like Sarah to stumble upon it. Her breath quickened. Where was she? What had happened? The world around her spun, and she was unsure whether she was still standing in the library beneath Dunridge, or if the town itself had become her prison. She had broken the curse, or so she had hoped. But the truth was beginning to make itself clear. There was no breaking free. There was no escaping Dunridge. Not anymore. The shattered mirror lay on the floor before her, but now its pieces were gone. Where it had stood, a void opened, empty, dark, and deep, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The town's heartbeat. Sarah's vision blurred as she stumbled backward, her hands pressing against the walls for support. It felt as though the very walls of the library were breathing alive, pulsing with energy, with intent. The whole town was watching her, suffocating her from all sides. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of terror clouding her mind. She needed to focus. She needed to think. The knowledge she had uncovered about the lost souls, the erasures, the curse, had been too much, overwhelming her. Yet the most chilling revelation of all remained. Sarah was not meant to break the curse. She was the curse. You are a part of the memory now. The whisper pierced through the darkness again, coming from the corners of her mind, echoing like a nightmare that refused to leave. It was Sophie's voice, but somehow different, cold, empty. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat, swallowed by the suffocating silence of the library. The walls seemed to stretch infinitely, pushing her deeper into the abyss. What had she done? The unseen truth. The truth was dawning on her like a slow, agonizing realization. She had thought she was just a bystander, investigating a town shrouded in mystery. But in reality, she had been chosen, just as Sophie had been. She wasn't just uncovering the history of Dunridge, she was becoming part of it. The curse had been designed for her. She was the final piece. The echo of Sophie's voice grew louder, twisting in her mind, suffocating her thoughts. Don't you see, Sarah? You are part of the town. This town, its souls, its memories, they feed off you. Her heart pounded, her hands shaking. Was this the truth? Had she been chosen to be a part of the town's memory, to become one of its lost souls like Sophie? The more she thought about it, the more the words made sense. It wasn't about breaking the curse. It was about living with it, becoming one with it. The town could never forget her now. She had already become part of the cycle, an eternal part of its dark history. You will fade away, just like Sophie, just like all the others. The struggle, the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. Her vision blurred again, her knees buckling beneath her as the air around her seemed to tighten. But then something shifted. A glimmer of defiance stirred within her, a spark that refused to be extinguished. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. She could still break the cycle. She had to. She turned toward the shelves of books lining the walls. Knowledge, it was always the key. The library had once been a place of discovery, a way to understand the curse, to uncover the truth. But now it felt like a trap, a prison that had been built to contain her. The whispers intensified, but Sarah shut them out, forcing her mind to focus. The truth lay in the books, in the records, in the stories of the people who had been swallowed by Dunridge. She just had to find the final piece, the missing link that would allow her to break free. As she approached the nearest shelf, she grabbed a book, an old leather-bound tome that had somehow escaped her attention before. She flipped it open, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages. Her eyes skimmed the words, and then there it was. The key to the town's curse was not just in its people. It was in the memories themselves, the town's heart, its lifeblood. Dunridge existed because of its forgotten past, its erased souls. And in order to break the curse, she would have to destroy the very memory of the town itself. The final confrontation, a deep, unsettling silence filled the library as Sarah closed the book, her mind racing. To break the curse, she would have to sacrifice everything: her identity, her history, her connection to the town. The memory of Dunridge would be wiped clean, its souls erased, and in doing so, she would become a blank slate, free of the town's influence. But at what cost? The shadows in the library seemed to shift, the whispers growing louder once more. They weren't just voices anymore. They were a force, pulling at her, suffocating her. You can't erase us, Sarah. You can't undo what has already been done. She felt her feet move, her body guided by some unseen force. The darkness around her seemed to swirl, thickening, until the entire room was a blur of shadows. She tried to fight it, but the pull was too strong. And then she saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway. It was Sophie, but not Sophie as she remembered her. She was older, her face twisted with the sorrow of 1,000 years. You can never escape, Sarah. You're already lost. Sophie's voice was a hollow whisper, but it carried the weight of every soul that had been swallowed by Dunridge. The moment of truth. In that final moment, Sarah knew what had to be done. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been erased by the town's curse. And if she had to sacrifice herself to break the cycle, then she would. She had to. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the book, the final piece. The words on the pages blurred, and as they did, the walls of the library seemed to crack, the ground shaking beneath her feet. She could feel the town itself protesting, trying to keep her locked in its grasp. But Sarah didn't hesitate. With one final scream, she slammed the book shut. Cliffhanger ending. The room exploded into light. The air around her vibrated, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though the very essence of Dunridge was being torn apart. But then, everything stopped. The world paused, the voices fading into nothingness. Sarah stood alone in the center of the library, the silence deafening. The mirror was gone. The shadows were gone. The whispers had vanished. And in the stillness, Sarah realized that she had done it. She had broken the curse. Or had she? The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Was it over? Or was this just the beginning? Episode 10, The Last Breath. The shattered silence. The silence that had followed the chaos was unlike any Sarah had ever experienced. For a brief, fleeting moment, it was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. The violent shaking of the library, the crackling energy that had filled the air, all of it stilled. It felt like the final gasp of something long dead. Sarah stood motionless, her body stiff with the aftershock. She couldn't understand what had just happened. One moment, she had closed the book, believing it would break the curse. The next, the entire town seemed to writhe, as though it were fighting against her actions. But now there was only the quiet, the oppressive stillness that had taken over everything. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. Had she succeeded? Or had she made some terrible mistake? Dunridge was no longer the same place it had been when she first arrived. The air was no longer thick with whispers, and the shadows no longer felt as though they were creeping up behind her. But was that a sign that the curse had been lifted? Or had it simply shifted, gone deeper into the heart of the town? Sarah, The voice was familiar, yet cold, a reminder of everything she had fought against. Sophie's voice, distorted and empty. Sarah turned toward the source of the voice. She knew what she would find, and yet she was unprepared for the sight that greeted her. Standing at the far end of the library, amidst the scattered remnants of shattered glass and old books, was Sophie, her face twisted, her eyes empty, as if she were a reflection of the curse that had bound the town together. "Sophie," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her heart pounding. "Is it over?" But Sophie didn't answer. Instead, her eyes locked onto Sarah's, her expression one of emptiness, as though she were seeing something that wasn't truly there. Her lips moved, but the words didn't reach Sarah's ears. The silence, thick and suffocating, swallowed them whole. And then, a sound cut through the quiet, a sound that filled the room with an undeniable dread. The clock, ticking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. The ticking seemed to echo in every corner of the library, reverberating through the very walls, as if time itself was slipping away. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the source of the sound, the old grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't supposed to be there. The heartbeat of Dunridge as Sarah approached the clock. The world seemed to fold around her. The space in front of her warped, like looking through a distorted mirror. The clock's hands ticked with an unnatural speed, faster and faster, until they were a blur, as if the clock was trying to hurry something. The room began to pulse, as though the heartbeat of the town itself was starting to quicken. The walls seemed to press inward, tightening around her chest. The library, the town, was alive, and it was now beginning to suffocate her. The weight of the memories, of the forgotten souls, began to press down on Sarah, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the darkness closing in, the void that had been hidden behind the mirror, now surfacing. It was more than just a curse, it was a living entity, a force that fed off of memory, identity, and time itself. "You cannot escape." Sophie's voice again, but it was no longer just Sophie. It was the voice of the town, the force that had consumed it all. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the clock's surface. The moment she touched it, the world around her twisted and buckled. She could feel the weight of every forgotten soul, every lost piece of history. She could feel the lives that had been consumed, erased, and buried under the weight of time. She could hear their whispers, their cries for help, and in that moment, she understood. The town of Dunridge was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to feed on the memories of those who passed through, to consume their very existence until nothing remained but the darkness that had been created by the curse. The breaking point. The clock stopped. The hands froze, pointing to the hour of midnight, as though marking the exact moment when everything would either end or begin. The air thickened, the shadows growing long and oppressive, surrounding Sarah as if they were alive. The walls of the library groaned, the bookshelves creaking under the weight of memories long buried. She could feel it then, the presence that had been following her, the force that had haunted the town since its inception. It was here, and it was ready to consume. In the center of the room, the shadows swirled, forming a shape, a figure. It was not human. It was something ancient, something that had existed long before Dunridge had been built. The figure was vast, an entity made of shadow, its form a twisted collection of faces and voices, all forgotten, all lost to time. "You should have never come here," it rumbled, its voice a collective hiss, filled with centuries of rage and hunger. Sarah's knees buckled, her body trembling as she backed away. This was the end, the culmination of everything she had uncovered. She had broken the curse, or so she thought, but the truth was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. The figure advanced, its dark form stretching toward her, like a massive hand reaching out from the depths of the void. It was not going to let her leave. There is no escape. The voice became a shrill screech, the sound of countless souls crying out in agony. But Sarah was no longer afraid. The choice had already been made. She had known, deep down, that there was only one way to break the curse, and it wasn't by escaping. It was by confronting it. The final sacrifice. Sarah turned toward the clock, now glowing with an otherworldly light. She could see the answers now, the truth that had been hidden from her all this time. She had to give herself to the town, to the cycle of memory. She had to become one with it, to erase the curse not by running from it, but by embracing it. The air around her shifted, and Sarah felt the cold creeping into her bones, as though the town itself was pulling her into its embrace. The darkness surrounded her, but now it felt different. It felt like peace. She closed her eyes, and the whispering stopped. The shadowed figure dissolved into the ether, the memory of Dunridge fading into the distance. The quiet after the storm. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the library was still. The weight of the curse was gone, the shadows no longer pressing in on her. The town was still, as though it had forgotten she had ever been there. The clock was silent. Sarah looked around, the overwhelming silence settling into her bones. She had done it. She had broken the cycle, erased the town's history and all the suffering it had caused. She could leave now. She could finally escape. But something stopped her. In the distance, she heard a soft whisper, barely audible. It was Sophie's voice, clear and gentle. "Thank you." And then it was silent again.